You've learned how to use relational and logical operators. Now let's dig a little deeper into what these operators are doing. It's important to understand that operators like less than or logical or are not that different from operators like plus or minus. All of these operators take operands and return a value. It's true that we usually use relational and logical operators within if statements, but that isn't actually a necessity. In fact, these operators can show up anywhere that other operators show up. When we write 3 plus 5, we know that this expression will evaluate to 8. But what happens when we write 3 is less than 4? What does an expression containing less than evaluate to? To answer these kinds of questions, it's useful to assign the result of a relational or Boolean expression to a variable, and then inspect that variable. We have 3 variables here. We're going to assign the result of a relational or logical expression to each one. Here we assign the result of 4 is less than 5 to x. The parentheses are optional here because the precedence of the assignment operator is lower than that of the less than operator, but we have included the parentheses for clarity. 4 is less than 5 is true. This line includes an expression that is false, and this line contains an expression that is true. So we have a true, then a false, then a true expression. And the question is, how are true and false represented? What values get assigned to the variables x, y, and z? Let's run our code. We see that true is represented as value 1, and false is represented as value 0. So the relational and logical operators return value 1 for true and value 0 for false. And then those values are used to control our if statements. Now let's consider 3 strange-looking if statements. Which of the 3 messages are going to print? Remember that 0 is the representation of false. This if statement is therefore using a false value as its condition. And of course, false is not true. So first will not be printed. Let's look at our second if statement. Remember that 1 is the representation of true, so this if condition is always true. Second should be printed. What happens with the third if statement? This one is the most strange of all because it doesn't use a 0 or a 1. Is 2 true? Is 2 false? Well, it turns out that every numeric value except 0 is considered to be true. So third gets printed because 2 is interpreted as true. You're probably wondering why we'd write if statements like this. Wouldn't every conceivable reasonable if statement use a relational or logical operator as we did in previous videos? In fact, no. C programmers frequently use if statement constructions with no operators at all, relying on the interpretation of 0 as false and everything else as true to write concise if statements. For example, consider the program fragment here. When does the code in this if statement run? Think about it for a minute. It runs whenever the value x is interpreted as true. This occurs when x is not 0. The if statement protects against the undefined operation of dividing 5 by 0. Of course, we could have written x is not equal to 0 here to be more explicit, but it's common for C programmers to take advantage of shortcuts when they can. Is it better to do it this way? Not necessarily, but it certainly isn't wrong. If it is easier for you to think of writing x is not equal to 0, then do it that way in your own code. But you're going to have to read and understand code written by other programmers. So even if you choose not to use these shortcuts in your programs, you will need to be able to interpret them correctly.